Hello everyone and welcome to my classroom. I'm Claire and today I'm going to be doing a read aloud on this book, It's a Wonderful Life. And this It's a Wonderful Life is my all-time favorite Christmas movie. The Christmas movie was filmed in 1946. So all of my teachers and adults and parents, you probably have all seen it. It's famous and it's one of my all-time favorite movies ever. Like maybe I wouldn't even say just Christmas, just hands down my favorite movie. I also love like old classic movies anyway, but the message of It's a Wonderful Life is amazing. So I was searching a few weeks ago for children's books and Christmas books, and I stumbled upon this one and I was like, I have to get it. Like, this is my favorite story. And I actually absolutely love it, and I'm 22 years old and I find myself reading it, and so have some of my family members. So this book was adapted by Paul Ruditis, and the images are just gorgeous. I'll be getting into them obviously in my read aloud after this intro. So the author adapted the story in a very kid-friendly way, and it's perfect for your students and your children. This book is just amazing, and it goes far beyond just like a Christmas story. You could read this at any time. It's a story about loving what you have and being grateful for what you have, which is your family, your friends, and the people in your life, and not materialistic things or jobs. And it really, it's a great message for kids, I think, to get early on, knowing that, and I know most kids when they're young, they are like very grateful for what they have, but knowing, especially around Christmas time, that, it's not about the presents and it's not about the materialistic things, it's about the people around you. And I think it's just a wonderful message, and I'm so excited to do a read aloud on this. So stay tuned and I'll be getting into that now. A long time ago, back before there were televisions, before computers existed or credit cards, long before all that, a boy named George Bailey was growing up in a little town called Bedford Falls. He lived in that little town never knowing that an angel named Clarence was watching over him. Clarence was really an angel second class. That meant he hadn't earned his wings yet.
Even more than I usually do. And although I know it's a lot.
Clarence watched as George played with his friends. He saw the time George saved his younger brother, Harry, when he fell through the ice. He watched as George worked at Mr. Grauer's drugstore, running deliveries and helping the customers. One day, George stopped Mr. Grauer from accidentally giving the wrong medicine to a sick child. Mary Hatch often visited the store just to spend time with George. Clarence watched it all. When George got older, he worked for his father at the Bailey Brothers Building and Loan Office. George's father and his Uncle Billy helped people save their money so they could buy important things, like new homes. George didn't want to buy a new home in the little town of Bedford Falls. He dreamed of exploring the world and visiting exciting places he'd only read about in magazines. Years later, on the night before George planned to leave Bedford Falls to travel the world, he went to a party at his old high school. There, he danced with Mary Hatch. The dance was in the school gym, which had been built over the old pool. A jealous boy tried to ruin George and Mary's dance by opening the floor. But that didn't stop them from dancing. George walked Mary home that night, wearing dry clothes he'd found for them in the locker room. They made wishes by throwing rocks at the old, abandoned Granville house, trying to break the windows. George told Mary about his dreams to see the world. Mary didn't tell George what she wished for, but he made his best guess. "You want the moon? Just say the word and I'll throw a lasso around it and pull it down." On that same night, George's father passed away. No one trusted George's unforgetful Uncle Billy to run the family business. George had to stay in Bedford Falls, or else the company would close, and people would lose their money and their homes. That was exactly what Mr. Potter wanted. He was the wealthiest man in town, and he dreamed of owning all of Bedford Falls. The building and loan was one of the few businesses that could stop him from taking over the entire town. George stayed home to run the business. He gave the money he'd saved for his trip to his brother so that Harry could go to college and then run the business when he graduated. But when Harry came home from college, he had a wife and a good job that took him far away from the little town of Bedford Falls. George realized that no one was going to take over the business. He was never going to leave Bedford Falls to explore the great big world. Clarence saw that too. George didn't entirely mind staying in Bedford Falls because he and Mary had fallen in love. They got engaged and planned their honeymoon. It wasn't the great big trip that George had always dreamed of, but as long as he was with Mary, it would be wonderful all the same.
I'll be home for Christmas.
On the same day as George and Mary's wedding, Mr. Potter bought the town bank and tried to take over the building and loan. George and Mary gave up all of their savings to help George's customers. Now they couldn't afford to leave Bedford Falls for their honeymoon, but the company would not go out of business either. Mr. Potter would not win.
By the tree.
That night, Mary told George to come to the abandoned building they'd made their wishes on. She had bought it for them with the last of their money. They would have their honeymoon in that old house in Bedford Falls. Over the next few years, George and Mary turned that broken-down old house into a home. They filled it with 4 wonderful children named Pete, Janie, Zuzu, and Tommy. They helped more people in Bedford Falls. For instance, George made sure that Mr. Martini got enough money to buy his own new home so that he didn't have to keep renting that expensive house that Mr. Potter owned. George helped even more people move into new homes, and the little town of Bedford Falls began to grow. When a war broke out overseas, George stayed in Bedford Falls, protecting people from Mr. Potter's greed and working with his Uncle Billy to make sure their business stayed open. George's brother Harry went off to fight in the war, where he saved hundreds of soldiers. Everyone in the town was proud of Harry. The president even gave him a special award. Uncle Billy was so excited he forgot to put the customers' money in the safe. He accidentally left it all behind when he was bragging to Mr. Potter about Harry on Christmas Eve. It was the most important thing Uncle Billy had ever forgotten. Now, it was George's responsibility to find the money because he was the boss. If he didn't find it, he could go to jail. George and Uncle Billy searched all over town, but they didn't find anything. When George got home, he found his youngest daughter, Zuzu, upset because her flower had lost some petals. He couldn't fix that either, so he hid the petals in his pocket. It was the worst Christmas ever. George was so upset that he yelled at his family, even though they'd done nothing wrong. Mary told George to leave. Then she started calling people for help. She could tell that her husband was very sad. George went to the only person who could help. Mr. Potter was the richest man in town. Surely he could lend George some money. But the evil banker refused George's pleas for help, never admitting that he had the missing money all along. George couldn't go home, and he couldn't go to anyone else for help. No one in the little town of Bedford Falls had the amount of money he needed. George felt like a complete failure. He blamed himself for not being able to save the business, and he thought that Bedford Falls would be a better place if he weren't around to make things worse. That's when he heard the shouts from a man who'd fallen into the river below. George did what he always did. He dove in to help. George saved the man and learned that it was Clarence, the angel second class, who had been watching over him. Clarence tried to convince George that he wasn't a failure, that his life had actually been pretty good. George didn't believe any of it, especially not the part about Clarence being an angel second class. To prove it, Clarence made George's wish come true. Back at Mr. Martini's bar, Clarence tried to explain that helping George was the only way he'd earn his wings to become a full angel. George wasn't paying attention. The place looked so different, and his friend Mr. Martini was gone. Even the bartender, Nick, was different. But nothing prepared George to learn what happened to his old boss from the drugstore. Mr. Grauer had spent years in prison because George hadn't been around to stop him from giving the wrong medicine to that sick kid. So many things were different. Was it possible that Clarence was telling the truth? Maybe George had never been born, but George still wasn't ready to believe it. Not even when he discovered his daughter's flower petals were gone. George hurried home, surprised to find that the quiet little town of Bedford Falls had somewhat become a big, noisy town called Pottersville. The building and loan had gone out of business years ago because George wasn't around to run it. With no one to stop him, Mr. Potter had taken over the entire town and made it a terrible place to live. The changes didn't end there. George and Mary's home was still abandoned, as if his family had never lived there. His own mother didn't recognize him. Because George had never been born, no one had been around to save his little brother when he fell through the ice. Clarence explained that without Harry Bailey in the war, no one saved all those soldiers either. George was horrified to discover that the love of his life, Mary Hatch, didn't recognize him. If she didn't know him, then their children had never been born either. That's why Zuzu's petals weren't in his pocket. George was heartbroken to see that all these bad things had happened, just because he had never been born. George went back to the bridge where it all started, hoping that he could make everything right. He was all alone again, but he called out to Clarence. A moment after he asked for help, George's friend found him and recognized him once again. George was thrilled, but not nearly as happy as when he realized that his daughter's flower petals were back in his pocket. Everything was back to normal in Bedford Falls. Everyone on the street recognized George again. The Bailey Brothers Building and Loan was still in business. Only grumpy old Mr. Potter was upset by George's happiness. George ran all the way home. He knew that the police were there for him, but he didn't care. His family would be there too, and that's all that mattered. He never expected what else would be waiting at home for him. Everyone in Bedford Falls that George had ever helped turned out to support him in his time of need. They could replace all the missing money by adding together what little cash they each had. The business would survive. George may never have left the little town of Bedford Falls, but he'd spent every day of his life helping the people around him. And those people, in turn, were there for George when he needed them. Mr. Potter might have all the money in the bank, but money wasn't nearly as important as all the people who had come to help George in his time of need. On top of the money his friends had collected, George found a gift from Clarence. It seemed that George wasn't the only one whose dreams had come true. Clarence's gift wrote, "Remember, George, no man is a failure who has friends. Thanks for the wings."
If only in my dream.
The end.
If only in my dream.
I hope you all enjoyed. Please follow me on Instagram at Miss Clare's Classroom, where I post all things educational. And don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you guys, and Merry Christmas!